He only did the right thing. That was the thought that kept circling in Darius Washington's mind as he stood frozen in his own hallway, the smell of coffee he'd just brewed hanging uselessly in the air. He had simply done the right thing. He'd driven his boss, Elizabeth Vance, the formidable CEO of Vance Capital, home when she was too incapacitated to find her own keys, let alone drive. But home had become his home. His small two-bedroom apartment in Queens, a world away from her Park Avenue penthouse. And now, the next morning, as she stood in his living room, pale and confused in a pair of his late wife's grey sweatpants, one phone call was threatening to unravel the meticulously ordered life he had built for himself and his daughter. For a black man, a single father navigating a world that often saw him first as a threat and second as a person, there was no room for misunderstanding. The conversation he was overhearing, the raw terror in Elizabeth's voice as she spoke to her lawyer, was the sound of his worst fears taking solid form. It was the sound of a life about to be dismantled, piece by careful piece, all because he had chosen to be a good man. The day before had started with a promise sealed with a pinky swear, the most sacred of oaths between him and his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. "I'll be there, sweet pea," he had said, crouching down to meet her enormous, serious brown eyes. "Front row. I wouldn't miss your spring sing for the world." Lily had beamed, a smile that was all jasmine, his late wife, a radiant burst of light that could make the grimiest city morning feel like a sunrise. She clutched the sheet music for her solo, a small, brave rendition of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," and the sight of her standing there in her school uniform, ready to take on the world with a song, filled Darius with a fierce, protective love that was the central organizing principle of his universe. Since Jasmine's passing 3 years ago, that love had become his compass, his shield, and his reason for breathing. Everything he did, every cautious step he took, was for Lily. His job as a senior analyst at Vance Capital was a key part of that careful construction. It was a good job, a stable job. It paid the bills, kept their small but clean apartment, and funded Lily's art classes. But it was a world where Darius felt he had to be twice as good to be considered half as much. He kept his head down, produced immaculate work, and made himself as unobtrusive as possible. He was polite, professional, and perpetually invisible. In the gleaming steel and glass tower of Manhattan finance, a man like him didn't draw attention. You clocked in, you exceeded expectations, you clocked out. You never gave anyone a reason to look twice, to question, to suspect. Invisibility was a form of armor. Elizabeth Vance was the queen of that gleaming tower. She moved through the office like a force of nature, a whirlwind of tailored suits, sharp intelligence, and an aura of untouchable authority. Darius had exchanged maybe a dozen words with her in the 4 years he'd worked there. She was an abstract concept of power, someone whose moods and directives trickled down from the 50th floor to affect the lives of the hundreds below. Lately, the trickle had been acidic. Whispers followed her down the hallways. A messy divorce, a battle for control of the company her father had built. The tension was palpable. It clung to the air like static. That afternoon, the pressure had been immense. A critical quarterly report was due, and Darius was the lead on it. He'd planned his day with military precision, intending to finish by 4, grab the subway back to Queens, and be in his seat in the school auditorium by 6:30, with a bouquet of bodega carnations for his little star. But a last-minute data corruption had sent his team scrambling. The hours bled away. 4 o'clock became 5, then 6. He texted Mrs. Patterson, their saint of a neighbor, who was taking Lily to the school. "Running late. An emergency at work. I'm trying my best to get there. Please give Lily a huge hug for me and tell her I love her." The reply was instant. "Of course, dear. We'll save your seat." His heart hammered with the familiar dread, the dread of disappointing his daughter. He worked feverishly, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his mind a whirlwind of numbers and projections. Jasmine's voice echoed in his memory, a gentle whisper from a life that felt both a million years and a moment ago. You can't control everything, D. Just control your effort and your love. He focused on the effort, pouring everything he had into fixing the report. Finally, at nearly 8 o'clock, it was done. He hit send, a wave of exhaustion and adrenaline washing over him. He had missed the start of the show, but he could still catch Lily's solo. He could still make it. He grabbed his coat and bag and practically ran to the executive parking garage, a sterile, silent cavern beneath the bustling city. And that's where he found her, Elizabeth Vance. She was slumped against the driver's side door of her sleek black Mercedes, her head in her hands. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was a mess, one of her expensive heels was off, and she was sobbing. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ragged, gut-wrenching sobs that echoed in the concrete emptiness. Darius stopped. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, turn around, take the other exit, pretend he hadn't seen a thing. This was a problem for someone else, a problem for her driver, her assistant, her high-powered friends. Getting involved was a risk he couldn't afford. A black man, a powerful white woman, alone in a deserted garage at night. The optics were a nightmare. The potential for misinterpretation was a chasm waiting to swallow him whole. He thought of Lily, waiting for him. He should go. But then he heard a different voice. Jasmine's again, firmer this time. You see someone hurting, you help. It's not complicated. He hesitated, his internal battle raging. He saw the car keys on the ground, just out of her reach. He saw the dangerous vulnerability in her posture. He couldn't just leave her there. His own integrity, the very values he was trying to instill in his daughter, wouldn't let him. He took a deep breath and approached slowly, making his footsteps audible so as not to startle her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice soft. "Are you all right?" She looked up, her eyes unfocused and red-rimmed. The sharp, acrid smell of expensive whiskey hit him. She was drunk, not just tipsy, but profoundly, dangerously intoxicated. I can't," she slurred, gesturing vaguely toward the car door. "He's taking it all, my father's company. He's taking it." She dissolved into tears again. Darius checked his watch. 8:15 p.m. Lily's solo was probably happening right now. A sharp pain lanced through his chest. He had promised, he had pinky swore, but this woman was in no condition to be alone. He picked up her keys. "Ms. Vance, let me help you. Do you have a driver I can call? Someone who can take you home?" She shook her head, a confused, helpless gesture. "No driver tonight. I wanted to be alone." She fumbled for her purse, spilling its contents onto the concrete floor. Lipstick, a compact, a wallet. But her phone was nowhere in sight. It was probably still on her desk, or lost somewhere in the chaos of her day. He was now faced with an impossible choice. He could leave her here, a vulnerable woman in a deserted garage, and race to Queens to salvage the last few minutes of his daughter's big night. Or he could do the right thing, the human thing, and make sure she was safe, sacrificing the one moment he had been looking forward to all week. He looked at her, no longer the powerful CEO, but just a person in immense pain, and he knew what he had to do. Jasmine would have known. Lily, in her own simple, profound way, would have understood. "Okay," he said, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. "Okay, Ms. Vance, I'm going to help you get home. My name is Darius Washington. I work in analytics on the 34th floor. You're safe." He helped her to her feet, his touch professional and brief, supporting her by the elbow. He managed to get her into the passenger seat of her own car, buckling her seatbelt as she slumped against the window. He looked at the driver's seat of the Mercedes. Driving her car was another risk. What if he got pulled over? The questions would be immediate and suspicious. He made another decision. He locked her car, pocketing her keys securely. He then helped her out and guided her to his own modest 10-year-old sedan, parked a few rows over. It was safer, less conspicuous. As he helped her into his passenger seat, she mumbled an address on Park Avenue. He started the car and pulled out of the garage, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had missed it. He had missed his daughter singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. He had broken a pinky swear, and as he glanced at the incoherent woman beside him, he felt the first cold tendril of fear wrap around his heart. He was doing the right thing, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that doing the right thing didn't always protect you. Sometimes it was the very thing that could bring your whole world crashing down. The drive to her address was a blur of city lights and a silent, one-sided conversation with his wife's memory. "I hope I'm doing this right, Jazz. I really hope so." When they arrived at the opulent Park Avenue building, the doorman was polite but firm. Ms. Vance's ex-husband had been there earlier with a lawyer. The locks had been changed, a court order. Darius was stunned. He tried to reason with the doorman, explaining the situation, but the man's hands were tied. Elizabeth, rousing slightly, just stared at the grand entrance of the building she could no longer enter and let out a sound of pure despair. She had nowhere to go. Her purse contained no phone, and in her state, she couldn't recall a single friend's number. The options were stark and terrifying. A hotel. He couldn't just leave her in a lobby. The police. That would create a corporate and personal scandal that would certainly cost him his job. There was only one choice left, the riskiest and most compassionate of them all. He turned the car around and started the long drive back to Queens, to the small, safe world he had built for his daughter, a world he was now bringing a hurricane into. As he drove, he sent a final text to Mrs. Patterson. Something unavoidable came up. "I'm so sorry, I'm on my way home now. Please tell Lily I have the biggest apology ice cream sundae waiting for her in the morning." The reply came back, laced with a gentle concern. "She was wonderful, Darius. A true star. We'll see you soon." Each word was a fresh stab of guilt. He was a father who had just missed his daughter's moment of triumph to rescue the woman who signed his paychecks, a woman who didn't even know his name. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. Getting Elizabeth from his car and up the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment was an ordeal that tested his resolve. She was a dead weight, mumbling incoherently about betrayal and balance sheets. He finally managed to get the door open and guide her inside. The apartment was quiet. Mrs. Patterson had already put Lily to bed and had left a note on the kitchen counter. Lily was a champ, disappointed, but she understands you have important work. She left a drawing for you on her pillow. Don't be too hard on yourself. You're a good father. Martha. He read the note, and the dam of his composure finally broke. He leaned against the counter, the note crumpling in his fist, and fought back the tears that burned behind his eyes. He looked over at Elizabeth, who had collapsed onto his small sofa. Her expensive dress was wrinkled, her face stained with tears. She needed to be comfortable. He couldn't leave her like this. He made a decision born of pure, uncomplicated decency. He went into his bedroom, the room he had once shared with Jasmine, and pulled a clean pair of grey sweatpants and a soft t-shirt from the bottom drawer of her dresser, a small collection of clothes he could never bring himself to give away. They smelled faintly of the cedar chest they were stored in, a ghost of a scent that was both comforting and painful. He then faced the most awkward and necessary task of the night. He gently roused Elizabeth. "Miss Vance," he said softly, "you can't sleep in that dress. I have some clean, comfortable clothes for you. The bathroom is right there. I'll be in the living room." He spoke with a quiet authority, a gentleness that seemed to cut through her alcoholic fog. She nodded mutely, took the clothes, and stumbled into the bathroom. Darius retreated to the living room, his back to the door, listening to the sound of the water running. He felt like he was walking through a minefield in the dark. Every decision was fraught with peril. When she emerged a few minutes later, wearing Jasmine's clothes, a fresh wave of grief hit him. The sweats, which had been perfectly worn in on his wife's frame, hung loosely on Elizabeth's. Seeing them on another woman, in his home, felt like a betrayal, even though he knew it was a kindness. Elizabeth looked small and lost. He had already prepared his own bed for her, with clean sheets and a glass of water on the nightstand. "You can sleep in here," he said, gesturing to the open door. "It's my room. I'll take the couch." She didn't argue. She shuffled into the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, asleep almost instantly. Darius stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the surreal scene. The CEO of Vance Capital, a titan of industry, asleep in his bed in Queens, wearing his dead wife's clothes. He quietly pulled the door almost shut, leaving it cracked just enough to hear if she needed anything. He went into Lily's room. She was fast asleep, her chest rising and falling in the soft glow of her nightlight. On her pillow was a drawing. It was of him, in the front row of an auditorium, with a giant speech bubble that said, "Go Lily, go." Below it, she had drawn herself on stage, singing her heart out. A single, perfect tear rolled down his cheek and splashed onto the paper. He carefully folded it and put it in his pocket. It felt both like a treasure and a condemnation. He grabbed a blanket and a pillow from the hall closet and lay down on the lumpy sofa. Sleep felt impossible. His mind raced, replaying every decision, every risk. He had tried to do everything right. He'd left a note on the nightstand next to the water. "Miss Vance, you are unwell. I brought you to my home to make sure you were safe. Your car is in the office garage. Your keys are on the counter. My name is Darius Washington. My daughter and I live here. I will be on the couch. You are safe." He had tried to create a record of his intentions, a bulwark against the misunderstanding he feared so much. But as he stared at the ceiling of his quiet apartment, he knew that notes and intentions could be twisted. In the cold light of day, the facts were damning. A powerful, wealthy white woman had woken up in the home of her black male subordinate, with no memory of how she got there. The story wrote itself, and in that story, he was not the hero. He was the villain. He eventually drifted into a restless, dreamless sleep, the weight of the coming morning pressing down on him like a physical thing. The first sliver of dawn was creeping through the blinds when the sound of a voice from the bedroom jolted him awake. It was Elizabeth's voice, but it was different from the slurred, broken tones of the night before. It was sharp, tight, and laced with pure, undiluted panic. "Rachel. Rachel, thank God you picked up," she was saying, her voice a harsh whisper. I don't know where I am. I woke up in a strange bed, in an apartment." Darius sat bolt upright on the couch, his blood turning to ice. This was it, the moment he had dreaded. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He just listened as his life began to teeter on the edge of a precipice. "No, I don't remember anything after leaving the lawyer's office," Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining a frantic edge. "I think I was at the office garage. And then nothing. I'm in clothes. Not my clothes. Sweatpants. A t-shirt." There was a pause. Darius could imagine the lawyer on the other end, Rachel, her mind already assembling the worst-case scenario, her questions sharp and leading. "A man's apartment." Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. "Yes, I think so. I saw a man on the couch when I came out. A black man." Darius closed his eyes. That was the detail that would seal his fate. The fact of his race, dropped into the narrative like a match on gasoline. It changed the entire context. It turned a story of assistance into one of predation. He could feel the walls closing in. All his careful planning, his years of trying to be invisible and unimpeachable, had been erased in a single night of misplaced compassion. He was no longer Darius Washington, senior analyst, devoted father. He was a nameless, faceless suspect. "What do I do?" Elizabeth whispered into the phone. "Rachel, what do I do?" The silence stretched, thick with menace. Darius could practically hear the legal advice being dispensed, the cold, calculated steps to protect Elizabeth and incriminate him. "Call the police. Don't touch anything. Get out of there. Say you were assaulted." The possibilities were a gallery of horrors in his mind. He thought of Lily, asleep in the next room, so innocent of the storm that was gathering just outside her door. The thought of the police coming to his home, of being handcuffed in front of his daughter, was so horrifying it almost made him physically sick. He had to do something. But what? To speak up now would be to confirm his presence, to seem aggressive. To stay silent was to let the narrative be written without him. He was trapped. He heard Elizabeth moving around the bedroom. He heard the clink of the water glass he'd left for her. Then, a rustle of paper. She had found the note. For a beat, there was only silence. He held his breath, praying that his words, his carefully chosen, non-threatening words, would cut through her fear. "Wait," she said into the phone, her voice different now. A sliver of confusion had entered her tone, replacing the pure panic. "There's a note here." She read it aloud, her own voice reciting his words. "Miss Vance, you are unwell. I brought you to my home to make sure you are safe. Your keys are on the counter. My name is Darius Washington. My daughter and I live here. You are safe." Another pause. He imagined Rachel on the other end, dismissing it, a self-serving lie, a transparent attempt to cover his tracks. "I don't know, Rachel," Elizabeth said, her voice wavering. "Darius Washington. He works for me, in analytics." She was piecing it together, but the fear was still dominant. The story was still balanced on a knife's edge. And then, the worst possible thing happened. The door to Lily's bedroom creaked open. Lily stood there in her unicorn pajamas, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her hair a wild halo around her head. She saw Darius on the couch, then her eyes fell on the strange woman standing in the hallway, holding a phone to her ear. Lily didn't show fear, she showed curiosity. "Daddy," she said, her voice small and sleepy. "Is it morning?" Darius's heart stopped. He wanted to scream at her to go back to her room, to shield her from this, but it was too late. Elizabeth turned, her eyes widening as she saw the little girl. The sight of Lily, so small and vulnerable, seemed to shatter the tension in the room, replacing it with a profound and sudden awkwardness. Elizabeth lowered the phone slightly from her ear. Lily, meanwhile, padded over to the strange woman. She looked up at Elizabeth, her head tilted. She took in the tear-stained face, the borrowed clothes, the lost expression. And then she did something that changed everything. She reached out her small hand and gently touched Elizabeth's arm. "You look sad," Lily said, her voice clear and simple, like the kind of sad where you smile but your eyes don't. It was a direct quote from Jasmine, something she had said to Lily once about a character in a book. Hearing it now, in this context, was like a ghost walking through the room. Elizabeth stared down at the little girl, utterly speechless. The simple, unfiltered empathy from this child was so unexpected, so pure, it seemed to short-circuit the fear and suspicion that had been consuming her. She looked from Lily's face to Darius, who was now standing, his hands held slightly out to his sides, in a gesture that was both placating and protective. She saw not a threat, but a father who was terrified. "Rachel," Elizabeth said into the phone, her voice suddenly firm, resolute. "I have to go. I'll call you back." She hung up, cutting off whatever panicked instructions her lawyer was giving her. The silence that fell was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a reckoning. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Darius?" "Yes, Mrs. Vance," he replied, his own voice hoarse. What happened last night? She asked. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a genuine question. And so he told her. He told her everything, his voice quiet and steady, starting from finding her in the garage. He told her about the missed solo, the drive, the changed locks at her building, the decision to bring her here. He didn't embellish or editorialize. He just stated the facts, his gaze never leaving hers. He was laying his life in her hands, trusting that the truth would be enough. As he spoke, he saw the memory flicker in her eyes. Fragments were coming back to her. The cold concrete of the garage, the kindness in his voice, the feeling of being buckled into a car seat like a child. The shame and gratitude warred on her face. The full weight of what he had done, the sacrifice he had made, began to dawn on her. Your daughter, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You missed her performance? For me? You needed help, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And in his world, it was. Lily, who had been listening with the quiet intensity of a child, walked over to her small art table in the corner of the living room. She picked up a piece of paper and a crayon. She brought it over to Elizabeth. It was a drawing of a bright yellow sun with a huge smiling face. Everyone deserves to smile, she said, handing the drawing to Elizabeth. Elizabeth took the drawing, her hand trembling. She looked at the crayon sun, then at the little girl who had given it to her, and finally at the man who had sacrificed his own precious moment with his child to ensure the safety of a woman who barely knew he existed. In that small, humble living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love and integrity, Elizabeth Vance's carefully constructed world of power and privilege fell away, and she saw Darius Washington for the first time. She saw his decency, his quiet strength, his profound humanity, and she was utterly, devastatingly ashamed of the phone call she had just made. I need to make a call, she said, her voice choked. She picked up her phone again, her thumb hovering over Rachel's name. Darius watched her, his heart pounding. This was the second pivotal moment. The first had been the accusation. This would be the correction, or the final nail in his coffin. He held Lily's hand, drawing strength from her small, warm grip. Elizabeth hit the call button. When Rachel answered, Elizabeth's voice was like steel. Rachel, I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Nothing happened last night. I was intoxicated and distraught, and one of my employees, a man named Darius Washington, found me and helped me. He did nothing but show me kindness and respect. She paused, taking a deep breath. He has a daughter, Rachel, a little girl. He missed her school performance, her first solo, because he was driving me around the city, trying to find me a safe place to land after my ex-husband locked me out of my own home. He brought me here to his apartment. He gave me his own bed and slept on the couch. She looked directly at Darius, her eyes filled with a new, profound respect. He is a good man, a better man than most I know. I want you to make sure that any narrative we discussed is not only stopped, but erased. Do you understand me? This man's reputation will not be harmed because of my crisis. Are we clear? Darius felt a breath. He didn't even know he was holding rush out of his chest. It wasn't a full release. The knot of fear that lived permanently in his gut had been loosened, not untied, but it was enough. It was enough to breathe. He had been seen. The truth, for once, had been powerful enough to cut through the static of prejudice and fear. He squeezed Lily's hand, and she squeezed back, looking up at him with a small, knowing smile, as if she understood the magnitude of the moment in a way no adult ever could. In the quiet of the morning, a fragile bridge had been built between two people from different worlds, constructed not with steel or glass, but with a child's drawing and a father's quiet integrity. After the call, an awkward but potent silence filled the small apartment. Elizabeth Vance, the CEO, looked utterly out of place in her borrowed sweats, holding a child's crayon drawing of a sun. She finally looked at Darius, her expression a complex mixture of remorse and awe. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice stripped of its usual corporate authority. "Or how to apologize." "There's no need, Ms. Vance," Darius said, his voice even. He was still processing the near miss, the way his entire future had hung in the balance of her perception. Forgiveness was a step he wasn't ready for. Acceptance of the new reality was all he could manage. "Please," she said, shaking her head, "call me Elizabeth, and there is every need." She gestured around the apartment, at the worn but comfortable furniture, the framed photos of him, Lily, and Jasmine on the wall. "You brought me into your home. You trusted me in your space, with your daughter nearby. And my first instinct was to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The shame was too great. "You were scared," Darius said, offering a grace he wasn't sure she deserved, but that his own character demanded. "You were disoriented. It's understandable." "No," she insisted. "It's not. It's a product of the world I live in, the advice I'm given. It's inexcusable." She looked at Lily, who was now quietly organizing her crayons by color. "She's beautiful. She's just like her mother, isn't she?" Elizabeth asked, her gaze falling on a photo of Jasmine laughing, her head thrown back in joy. Darius felt a pang in his chest. "Yes," he said softly. "She is." This was the moment he dreaded in these situations. The transactional moment. The wealthy person, seeking to assuage their guilt, reaching for their checkbook. He could see the thought forming behind Elizabeth's eyes. "I want to make this right," she said, her voice shifting slightly, becoming more practical. "For Lily, for missing her show, I can set up a trust for her, for college. It's the least I can do." Darius felt his back stiffen. It was a generous offer, a life-changing offer, but it felt wrong. It felt like a payment for his integrity, a way to close the ledger on a debt she felt she owed. It cheapened the sacrifice. "No, thank you," he said, his voice firm but respectful. Elizabeth looked taken aback. "No, but I insist, it would be no trouble." "Ms. Vance—" "Elizabeth," he corrected himself. "My daughter doesn't need a trust fund from a stranger. She needs her father. And what I need, what I've always needed, is just to be able to do my job without being invisible, and to be seen as who I am when I'm not." It was the boldest thing he had ever said to a superior, perhaps the boldest thing he had ever said in his professional life. The words hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to the power dynamic that had defined their relationship until now. He continued, the words pouring out of him now that the dam was broken. "Last night, I wasn't your analyst. I was just a person helping another person. This morning, when you made that first phone call, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a stereotype, a threat. Your second phone call, you gave me my name back. That's more valuable than any trust fund. All I ask is that you remember that. Not just for me, but for everyone who works for you. See the person. That's all." Elizabeth was silent for a long time, truly listening. The lesson was landing with the force of a physical blow. She had spent her life managing assets, mitigating risks, and moving people like chess pieces on a board. She had never been asked to simply see them. The concept was both profoundly simple and utterly foreign. She looked at the crayon drawing of the sun in her hand, then at Lily, then at Darius. She nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. And for the first time, Darius believed she actually did. A plan began to form in her mind, a way to make amends that wasn't about money, but about presence. "Her performance," she said. "Is there any way, could she do it again? Maybe just for us?" Darius's heart swelled. It was a thoughtful question, a genuine one. "I can ask her teacher," he said. "Ms. Albright is very understanding." Later that day, after Elizabeth had retrieved her keys and left in a car she'd called, her demeanor humbled and transformed. Darius called the school. Ms. Albright was more than happy to help. She agreed to open the small auditorium for them the following afternoon, just for a special, private performance. When Darius told Lily, her eyes lit up. "For real, the whole stage. The whole stage, sweet pea," he confirmed, "just for you." The next afternoon, Darius and Lily walked into the empty school auditorium. The rows of vacant seats felt cavernous and intimidating. But then, the side door opened and Elizabeth Vance walked in. She wasn't wearing a power suit. She was in simple dark slacks and a soft sweater, her hair pulled back. She looked approachable. She was holding a small but beautiful bouquet of lilies. She walked not to the front row, but to a seat in the middle, giving them space. She smiled a small, genuine smile at Lily. Ms. Albright went to the piano on the side of the stage. Darius took his seat, front and center. His designated seat, saved for him. Lily, looking impossibly small on the vast stage, took a deep breath. Ms. Albright played the opening notes of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And then Lily sang. Her voice, clear and pure, filled the empty hall. It was hesitant at first, then grew in confidence. She sang of a world beyond the rain, of dreams that you dare to dream. And as she sang, Darius didn't just hear a song. He heard the echo of his wife's optimism, the resilience of his daughter's spirit, the culmination of all his hopes and fears. He watched his daughter, his beautiful, brave daughter, and the tears he had held back for so long finally came. They weren't tears of sadness or guilt, but of overwhelming love and pride. He was so focused on her that he barely noticed Elizabeth, a few rows back, was also quietly wiping tears from her own eyes. When the last note faded, the silence was profound. Then, Darius and Elizabeth were on their feet, the sound of their applause echoing through the auditorium. Lily took a small, perfect bow. Elizabeth walked down the aisle and handed Lily the bouquet. "You were magnificent," she said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "Your mother would have been so proud." Lily beamed, burying her face in the fragrant flowers. "My daddy said she's always watching," she said, "like a star you can't always see in the daytime, but you know it's there." Elizabeth looked at Darius over the top of Lily's head, and in that shared glance, a new understanding was cemented. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was something more foundational, a deep mutual respect that transcended the boundaries of their positions, their races, and their worlds. The following Monday, something was different at work. When Darius walked into the office, he wasn't met with the usual polite indifference. A few people who had never spoken to him before nodded and said, "Good morning, Darius." It was small, but it was noticeable. The memo had clearly gone out, not in an official capacity, but through the subtle channels of corporate power. Darius Washington was to be respected. He was to be seen. Later that morning, he was called into a meeting with the head of his department and Elizabeth herself. He walked in, his stomach tight with apprehension, but Elizabeth smiled at him. A real smile. They weren't there to discipline him. They were there to offer him a promotion, a new position, leading a special projects team that reported directly to her. It was a role focused on community impact analysis, studying how the firm's investments affected real people in real neighborhoods. It was work that mattered, work that required not just a skill with numbers, but a deep sense of humanity. "The job is yours if you want it," Elizabeth said. "It will be more demanding, but it will also give you a voice in this company that you've earned." Darius was stunned. It was more than he could have imagined. It was a chance to build a better future for Lily, not just with money, but with purpose. Yes, he said. "Thank you. I accept." "There's one condition," Elizabeth added, a serious look on her face. "The hours are firm, 9 to 5, no exceptions. Your evenings and weekends belong to your daughter. This company was my father's life. It almost cost him his family. It almost cost me, well, everything. I'm trying to build something different here, something better. And that starts with respecting the lives of the people who build it with me." Darius looked at her, the woman who just days ago had been a symbol of a distant, uncaring power structure. He saw the change in her, the hard-won clarity in her eyes. She wasn't just fixing a problem anymore. She was changing her world, and in doing so, she was changing his. For years, Darius had lived his life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to never give anyone a reason to question his character. He had built walls of caution and professionalism around himself and his daughter, a fortress to protect them from a world he knew could be unfair and unforgiving. But that night in the parking garage, he had made a different choice, a dangerous choice. He had chosen to be visible, to be human, to connect. And somehow, against all odds, it had led him here, to a new job, a new sense of purpose, and a new, unlikely ally. Maybe the world wasn't fair, maybe it never would be. But he was learning that it wasn't entirely made of concrete and steel, of suspicion and fear. There were pockets of grace. There were people who could learn, who could change, who could be moved by a child's drawing of a sun. There were people who, when given the chance, could see him for who he really was. And as he walked out of that office, no longer an invisible analyst, but a respected leader, he thought of Jasmine and of Lily's song. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet confidence that had been absent for too long. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to meet it, not with his head down, but with his eyes wide open, ready to be seen. That evening, as he tucked Lily into bed, she held up the drawing she had made for him, the one from the night of the spring sing. "You can frame this one, Daddy," she said, "to remember that you're always in my front row, even when you're not." He took the drawing, his throat tight with emotion. He had been so consumed by the guilt of his absence, he hadn't fully appreciated the depth of her understanding, her unconditional love. She hadn't seen a broken promise. She had seen a father doing his best. "I love you, sweet pea," he whispered, kissing her forehead, "more than all the stars in the sky." "I know, Daddy," she murmured, already drifting off to sleep. "Mommy told me." He stood in her doorway, watching her sleep, the drawing clutched in his hand. He thought about the life he and Jasmine had planned, a life full of music and laughter and shared dreams. Grief was a strange country. You never truly left it. You just learned to navigate its terrain. For 3 years, he had navigated it by playing defense, by protecting what was left. But now, something had shifted. He was ready to build again, to honor Jasmine not by staying frozen in the past, but by embracing the future with the same courage and compassion she had embodied. He wasn't just Lily's protector anymore. He was her example, and he would show her that a life lived with integrity, kindness, and an open heart was a life worth living, no matter the risks. The world might be full of shadows, but as long as he had her, he would always have his son. Darius's story reminds us that character isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the small choices when no one is watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about real people facing real challenges with grace. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Darius's situation?